So thank you everyone for joining us for another edition of Lake County Lake Lovers, updates on our lakes. And I am very happy to have experts and engineers on the call today. And we have questions that have been submitted by a number of lakes, which will be addressed by our biotech expert, Dave Shackleton, who's here with from SIS.BIO and lending his expertise to share what's been accomplished at other lakes. Before we begin, I'd just like to share what we've been able to accomplish with our Lake County Lake Lovers, because it's been in a group that was established online through our Global Waterworks Network. And when you come in, you can see a simple FAQ that walks you through all of the resources and knowledge that you can gain. And you also get access to the full Global Waterworks community. But in this FAQ, we encourage you to just go through and understand, what are harmful algae blooms, how they form. Dave has provided an overview for last year's World Water Day. And, what is the impact on property values? There's actually a 20% decline or increase if you take care of your water. And the history of treatment for the last 50 years, the focus has been on monitoring and measurement because they did not understand how to address the flow of nutrients into our lakes. And Wayne Carmichael, who Dave has worked closely with to monitor 6 different lakes for treatment over the last 4 years, proposed at last year's International Conference on the Toxic Cyanobacteria that the next 50 years, we have an opportunity to remediate and prevent harmful algae blooms. And that's what you're going to hear more about today. And we're thrilled that the Government Accountability Office also saw the need to change that. They issued a report last year talking about agencies needing to take more active treatment to manage risks of these blooms because they are impacting 40% of our world's waterways. And as I said, Wayne walks through this multi-level method. So we're not talking about a simple technology. We're not trying to sell you on a specific vendor, but trying to show how the holistic treatment has permanently eradicated HABs as long as it is maintained. And you can see case studies. We are very happy that this solution has been utilizing data to demonstrate the actual removal of invasive weeds and muck from our lakes, and to transform lakes like this Lake Rogerine that looks like it's almost dead, like many lakes that we see around Lake County that are closed and having problems with E. coli. They can be restored to their original process through the basic food web. So all of this information plus 2,700 experts or interested parties around the globe are connected here in the Global Waterworks community. And we want to give a shout out to the Lake County Health Department, the Stormwater Management Commission, who have provided tremendous resources that are available to everyone. And you can get involved simply by joining the community. Finding people, clicking on their names, and following them in the community, and also you can contribute information to the community. So you can look at events. This current event is happening right now. You can find members near you, which is a beautiful feature of this Mighty Network solution. You can see the newest member, and Judd Hansen, he's right here on this call. So, and you can find them based on where they are in the proximity of Lake County or the world. As you travel to Africa or California, you'll find people. So, and you can travel and also stay on top of what's happening in the community. And I just want to also give a shout out to our youth who helped make the case for lakes, a beautiful story in this last week, as they stood up in front of the county board and said, hey, we care about our lakes, we need access to them, and held up posters of the herons and the fish and a vision for the future, which we hope you all will embrace. We don't want to be going forward saying, help save our lakes with fish kills and beach closures and properties unable to be sold. We want to say, let's envision a brighter future where the fish are robust. The people can always play on beaches and schedule time, and they can sell their properties because the lake vantage point is beautiful and clear and showing abundant waters. And so this whole movement is very exciting because it's all about citizens having a voice for their lakes. And we invite you to join the Lake County Lake Lover community. It's part of the broader globalwaterworks.org community. And I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it over to Dave. But we do invite anyone to also, if they feel strongly about this, to click the link to donate now and or participate as a contributor, as well as a contributor of knowledge, which we're happy to have here on today's call. So Dave Shackleton, who's been working on this for 10 years and runs SIS.BIO and also is part of clean-flow.flo.com, where you can find information about his solutions. So note any questions in the chat, we'll get to them. And our goal is to have a recording that you can share with other people to put your mind at ease that this natural nature-based process is something that could work or may not be appropriate for your specific lake. So Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Mary. For some reason, it's not, PowerPoint does this sometimes, I don't know why.
It looked good a minute ago, came up.
Yeah, I know, but it's it's just not progressing. Let's try again. Can everybody see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
All good. So Mary's asked me today not to focus too much on cyanobacteria, but focus, I guess, more on some of the problems that are already real and present in the lakes at the moment. I think Long Lake's the only one that really suffers from toxic HABs, but it's all a process. The process is called eutrophication, and that word comes from the Greek, and it actually means well nourished. So, to me, the obvious question is, what is the problem with a well-nourished aquatic environment? And the fact is that it's not the food web and the animal life that would be consuming the algae and so on that are well-nourished. It's the algae, the invasive weeds and so on that are monopolizing all the nutrients. And that's the problem. They're the life forms that are well-nourished, and the ones that we need to be well-nourished are getting wiped out and constrained and so on. Which means that it's all about nutrient management, and the basic of sort of cycle of life is nutrients produce biomass. Biomass either produces waste, which decomposes to produce nutrients again, or that biomass dies off, whether it's vegetable or animal, decomposes and produces nutrients again. So to get to grips with it, you have to get to grips with the nutrient cycle. So if we look at how that operates, in a lake or a reservoir or whatever, there's always nutrients coming in. There has been for millions of years, and for millions of years, nature has been able to cope with that and process and get rid of those nutrients and keep the water quality good enough for people to be able to drink and use. So when those nutrients enter a water body, they are initially taken up by phytoplankton, algae, and the food web. And I've got two fish here, but what you're really talking about is the zooplankton, the crustaceans that eat the zooplankton, the fish that eat the zooplankton, everything up the food web. They consume that algae, and they themselves, are removed by land-based animals. So that is the sort of biological channel by which those nutrients are cleared from the water and water quality is maintained. Now, what happens, and what has happened particularly in the last sort of 100, 200 years, since we have been building wastewater treatment plants and going for waterborne sewage. In the old days, all the sewage basically stayed on the land. You dug a pit and that's where it went. With urbanization and population growth and so on, all that's directed into wastewater treatment plants, which discharge into waterways. And even though the level of nutrients are reduced in the wastewater treatment plant, the residual levels still have an impact. That coupled with agricultural runoff and stormwater that doesn't soak into the land because we've got, asphalt and concrete and so on. More and more of it gets directed into the water. So what happens is, instead of nutrient clearance, we get increased levels of nutrients coming in. We have more algae produced than the food web can consume during that algae's lifetime, because algae cells typically only have a life cycle of a few days. So after a couple of days, the excess that's unconsumed, and like any buffet, you can only eat so much. So the excess that's unconsumed, that dies off and sinks to the bottom. And that's where the problems start, because when that decomposes, it takes oxygen from the water in doing so, and it creates a mucky sediment, which is nutrient rich and is ideal for invasive weeds to grow in. So the nature of your aquatic vegetation starts to change. And one of the effects of that often is to have vegetation that is not suitable to fish, and all the muck on the bottom is not conducive to the fish spawning. So the animal life starts to become constrained. But more importantly, when that dead biomass decomposes, it takes oxygen out of the water. So you get oxygen depletion, hypoxia from the bottom. And then what happens is, once it's decomposed, you now have a second source of nutrients, because those nutrients can be loaded back into the water and they produce additional algae on their own. And so that's why we have more and more algae as this process sort of continues. Now, initially, the animal life will be able to still consume what it can, but you're recycling, and that algae acts as a capture mechanism for to take the inflow nutrients and deposit them in the sediment. But with more and more deoxygenation of the water, the animal life cannot survive in the deoxygenated water. So they have to move up into the water column. So instead of, if you've got 20 feet deep water, if there's no oxygen below 10, then the animal life is all constrained into only a small part of the water. So the effective amount of water in which animal life and the food web is functional is reduced. So your water volume is effectively reduced by that action, which means the amount of nutrients that are cleared are reduced, which means you get more and more sediment. So now you've got positive feedback loops going in. There's more and more nutrients reloaded, more and more algae produced, and you get into this vicious cycle. And eventually what happens is, the animal life becomes reduced because it can't survive there. With that, it's easy to understand why algicides, for instance, make the situation worse, because if you apply algicide, you kill the algae, it sinks to the bottom and produces more sediment. The same with herbicides. If you're applying herbicides, the same sort of thing happens. You kill off that vegetative biomass, and I'll show you an instance of that just now, and that decomposes to produce more and more sediment. So those sort of treatments are short-term, symptomatic, cosmetic, but in the long term, you're actually paying good money to make the situation worse. And that's one of the things Mary mentioned, the Government Accountability Office. It's one of the things they point out in their report, is that historically these treatments, algicides and things like that, actually make the situation worse, and we need to get away from that and get towards prevention and remediation by addressing the root causes. And that's what our whole focus is. And if you say, well, what are those root causes? And this is what the Government Accountability Office report says. It says it's the hypoxia, because lack of oxygen constrains the food web. It's the accumulation of nutrients in the sediment, and it's the recycling of those nutrients. And the Government Accountability Report was on hypoxia and harmful algae blooms. And what you have here is perfect conditions for cyanobacteria to take over. Now, I'm not going to go into that today because that's a kind of bit of a diversion. But what do we do? So firstly, we have our own aeration technology. which is run by a compressor on the shoreline in a shed of this sort, or in a smaller application, it might be a cabinet. And I'll show you just now what is different about that, our oxygenation system. This is the sort of thing that you'll see inside the shed. It's a compressor or several compressors, whatever's required, and air lines running into the water. In the water, this is what you see. You barely see anything really. If the water's pretty still, you can see where these radar units are located. If the wind's blowing and the waves are blowing and so on, you can barely make out where they are. They don't pose any problem to the use of the lake. Can you see that little hand, my mouse moving around? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you see here where it is, there's a second radar unit. Here's one here. So you can just make that one out there. And if I play the video, you'll see there's a motorboat going to come past this unit here. So it doesn't in any way impede. People love swimming over the top of these radar diffusers. There you are.
Is it like a whirlpool?
No, not really. It's just it's just an uplifting of water. The water flows sort of from the bottom up towards the surface.
It's like a air diffuser then?
Yes, yeah. Now, what we do in order to get the design, the performance of the diffuser depends on the depth, and the deeper it is, the less of them you need. So, a very shallow lake, you'll need more than a deep lake. You can see in a lake like this, and this here is about, sorry, I don't need to do that, but it's about 20 feet deep, but you can see how far apart they are spaced. So, with depth, we don't need as many. I'll show you a 850-acre drinking water reservoir just now, and there I think we've got 24 of them. But in a shallower lake, you do need more. But what's different about them, and this is what I'll show now, is you need to oxygenate the bottom, or all the way down to the bottom. You need to create an aerobic environment in the upper portions of the sediment so that you can get aerobic digestion of that sediment. They say that aerobic digestion is 3,000 to 5,000 times faster than anaerobic digestion. So if it's anaerobic, the rate at which the sediment is sort of being digested is slower than the rate that it's accumulating, so you get a net accumulation. By oxygenating the upper portion of that sediment and then dosing with digestive enzymes, we're able to digest it faster than it's accumulated, and therefore we get a net decrease. So here's data showing this is a 30-foot deep lake, and they've taken dissolved oxygen at the surface, at the middle, and at the bottom. So you can see at the middle, 15 feet deep, there's no oxygen, 0.4. It's anaerobic. Typically, what you want to get is 5 milligrams of dissolved oxygen. The EPA says minimum 2.5. It needs to be above 2.5 or below 2.5 is considered hypoxic. So what you'll see here is after 10 weeks, we have 5.9 milligrams at the bottom, which is more than there was at the top to start with. And in the middle and the top, we have even more of that, more than that. This is another one, Lake Peekskill in New York. You'll see when we commissioned, basically at sort of 14, 15 feet, the dissolved oxygen dropped off and you had all that anoxic water. And here you are, this is what, 8 weeks, 9 weeks later, we're completely oxygenated all the way to the bottom. This is one in Missouri, and you'll see August 2021, had oxygen down to 5.5 meters, which is about 15, 16 feet. And below that, it dropped off completely. We began this program last year, 2022. So if we look at the same time of year, you can see we've got more than 5 milligrams all the way down. And that is what is different in this radar technology compared to conventional aerators, diffusers, bubblers, whatever you want to call them. They tend to just blow bubbles through the water, and they don't move the water, and they don't oxygenate the water down to the bottom. So the impacts of that, if you have anaerobic water and you don't have enough oxygen in the water, one of the things that happens is your coliforms are able to survive and multiply in that water. So this was Hamilton Lake in New Jersey, not far from where our office is. And they had a problem where between a lot of geese and also a sewage treatment plant upstream, and when they had storms, the stormwater used to flow into the sewage treatment plant and kind of flush it. And so they get a lot of coliforms coming down into the lake. So 300 is the level that the regulations say it must be below 300 for people to be able to use the beach. So we commissioned this on the 19th of July, and this is not this year, this is going back to 2014, maybe 2013, something like that. But it was at 500 when we commissioned the system and turned things on. And you can see within 4 days we were compliant. But what happened then, on the 30th of July, there was a rainstorm and bump. So this is, the stormwater inflow that brings in all those coliforms. And typically that would have hung around, and that would have been the situation for the rest of the summer. But because we have the water oxygenated, and all we're doing is plain, simple biology here, really. Coliforms like an anaerobic environment. If they're in an aerobic environment, they don't survive well. The oxygen doesn't favor them. They can't cope with it, and they get outcompeted by other things. So there you can see within 48 hours, 72 hours, we have the situation back under control, and it stays like that until we have another rainstorm, and then bump up it went again. But once again, within a matter of 72 hours, 48 hours, we have it under control. So that, I know there are lakes in the area that are suffering from that. If the water is well oxygenated, the coliforms won't be able to survive. If we now get onto the subject of muck and sediment digestion, or biodredging as it's called. So this is a lake in New Jersey, and it's not very big, which means we can get a nice photograph of the whole thing. And you can see what the situation was like. It was basically milfoil and a pondweed and algae trapped in all that surfaced pondweed. And it was topped out from shore to shore when we began the program. Now, we make a lot of use of bathymetry because we need it to understand the depth profile in order to design the system. We also need it in order to be able to measure and see what we're doing. So what we're able to do is look at the lake in profile. And that's what the lake looked like in 2019. The average depth was 6.3 feet, and it contained 70,000 cubic meters of water. During the winter of 2019-2020, it was very mild, and the weeds never really died off. So come March of 2020, the Lake Committee said, we know you don't like using herbicides, but we want to do that. We want to get it knocked down so that, we can get our lake back, sort of thing. So we said, okay, do it, which they did. I think it was the first week of April. And then at the end of May, once those weeds had all died down, settled to the bottom, decomposed, we went and did another scan, another bathymetric scan. And you'll see the average depth across the whole lake had been reduced by about 6 inches, which meant that 5,500 cubic meters of water had been lost. And, that shows you the impact of a single application of herbicides. But despite that, by the end of 2020, we had actually worked off all that biomass plus some additional, 2,300 additional. And by the end of 2021, we recovered another 9,800 cubic meters. So significant increase in the water in that water body, and obviously it looks completely different. This is what it looks like from the shoreline. And here again, the same sort of thing. You know, if you stand on the shoreline looking at it, you can see how the bottom is totally transformed. This is another one that Mary has actually visited up in near Grand Rapids in Michigan. You can see the change in depth. You can see how much deeper it's got. Again, we can look at it in profile. You can see how it has changed. The problem here was lily pads. And when we do the bathymetric scan, we also get this sort of data where we can, you can see that the red areas are where they're really dense. And people basically were battling to get access to the lake because the lily pads were growing all around the shoreline. 2 years later, you can see the difference in the density, the vegetation density. When we installed, you'll see that radar unit there, that was right up against the edge of the lily pads. And you can see lily pads on the far shore of it. That is what it looked like there. So you can see how, those lily pads have gone. And the reason they've gone is because we digested away the organic sediment that they were growing in. This is one of the houses on the lake, and believe it or not, they have a beach of their own, which you can see from there they couldn't get access to. That's what it looks like now. This is lastly one which shows the longer term effects. So if you can see my mouse at the top end of this lake, that I think is a 2-foot contour. So basically all this part here was only about 2 or 3 feet deep. This is the dam wall. And if you look at the vegetation, anything less than 10 feet deep was basically completely overgrown with weeds. So this is 5 years later. And you can see how here it's deepened, basically everywhere is deepened. The weeds have, more or less gone away completely. This is just taking that diagram on the left and highlighting the two-foot contour, which is this sort of yellow line. So you can see most of this area was 2 feet. The 5-foot contour, which is this, it's a very pale, almost white. And then this sort of purpley magenta thing is the 8-foot contour. That's what it looks like now. So you can see all the area that was 2 feet is, at least 5 feet. And the 8-foot contour is also pushed out. If we look at that, we could look at that in profile. This is that north end where you can see all the sediment for some reason had accumulated there. We digested it. If we look at the data, this is over 5 years. We measure the water volume in various different ways. But if we look at this here, we started off, we had 250,000 cubic yards of water when we started. That's increased every single year as we digested the sediment, to the point where the overall change is 138,000 cubic yards of additional water, because we digested 138,000 cubic yards of sediment. The other interesting thing to note here is that from 2017 to 2018, you can see we digested 47,000 cubic yards. 2019, we took the total to 107. 2020, there wasn't much of an increase, and that was because of the COVID travel restrictions. We weren't able to go and do the enzyme dosing, so there was a minimal increase that year. But once we resumed dosing, we've got rid of more sediment. An interesting thing we've done here is, if you take the average truck, had you done physical dredging, haul that material out and put it in a truck to take it away. A normal truck, I think, is either 15 or 20 cubic yards. That would have been 9,000 truckloads that you would have had to haul away, damaging the roads in the process in order to do that. And that 138,000 cubic yards is a 55% increase in the water volume. And lastly, if you look at the depth, you can see the average depth has gone from 5 feet to nearly 8 feet. So, really big increase there. So that, in summary, is how it all comes together. These things are all interlinked and interrelated. And if if the eutrophic process is allowed to continue, then it's just more and more sediment, the wrong vegetation, more and more algae, and the situation gets worse and worse. Whereas once you get a systemic process going, everything clears up, sediment goes, the animal life is restored, the water is reoxygenated, and you have a rebalanced, healthy lake. Just to go briefly into cyanobacteria for people on Long Lake, this was Lake Peekskill in New York. They test the water. I think it's from, I'm not sure, is it the end of June through to Labor Day, or middle of June through to Labor Day? It's about 70 or 80 days during the year. You can see in 2016, 2017, the lake was closed for the majority of summer. We began the program in 2018, 2019, 2020, there were virtually no closures. We do the same sort of thing in drinking water reservoirs. This is Bowling Green in Ohio. That's the Maumee River on the left, and the water in that is terrible. Bowling Green's drinking water reservoir that you can see outlined in blue there only holds about 28 days of water. So throughout summer, they have to keep drawing water from the Maumee River. This shows you what the water in the Maumee River is like. 150,000 cells per mil of algae in their reservoir. Even though they were using algicides, they still had 123,000 cells per mil. And of that, the vast majority was cyanobacteria, which obviously is a real problem if you're trying to produce drinking water. If we look at, we began the program in April of 2017. So if we look at the same time in 2017, week 31, you'll see the situation in the river was much the same, 150,000 cells per mil. But in the reservoir, we cut that by 75%. More importantly, the cyanobacteria had been brought under control. So we've got the right sort of algae and so on there. Just to give you some idea of scale, this is Toabaca Reservoir in Puerto Rico. You can see, if you see my arrow, you can see where the radar units are. This is 850 acres, and it's producing drinking water, except it couldn't produce drinking water because there was so much algae, there were fish kills, there were toxins in the water and so on. So we fixed all those problems up. The animal life all came back, which is a big part of what we're doing. This is another one in Colorado where the Ornithological Society actually put a post up on Facebook saying that the bird life in the lake that we had treated had transformed unbelievably. We actually contacted them and got them to kind of verify it and say that all these bald eagles and gulls and so on are back because the fish are back, because the cyanobacteria are not there, because the eutrophication is not there. So the whole thing all sort of comes together. And then lastly, this is a aquaculture operation in Australia. You've got two identical ponds side by side. This is the one that we are managing and maintaining water quality with our technology. And the camera will pan across to the other side where you'll see an identical pond using what has historically been considered the best possible technology. And you can see the difference in water quality. And they see that in the fish growth and the fish mortality and so on as well. So that's it in terms of presentation, but I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, well, you have an expert group here. So Raj, why don't you start it off with a question or comment?
Excellent presentation, Dave.
Thank you.
Just want to tell you about some of the practical experience that we had in our subdivision. We had a shallow lake, which was mainly created for runoff from subdivision. And that got filled up over the years with sediment. And at some places, it became 1 to 2 feet, some places 3 to 4 feet. And getting filled with algae all through summer. So some people in our subdivision said, let's dredge it for enormous cost, but we installed air diffusers after getting the depth profile of the lake. We installed about in this small 5-acre lake, about 5 to 6 diffusers run by small, motors there, which just columns at the bottom of the lake through the water column. They would get the air circulated, and within a year we saw a depth increase of 1 foot in the lake. The bottom sediment had slowly decomposed. But in addition to that, we stopped the sediment and nutrients from coming into the lake by making sure all the overhang trees, branches are all cut by the homeowners. And there are some grasses planted along the edges of the lake so that any fertilizers used by the homeowners in their lawns gets somewhat filtered, and told the homeowners to use less nutrients on their lawns. So simple things like you did, but even then, during hot days in summer, we had to have some duckweed algae control on the top and bio dredging to remove some of the accumulated biomass in the bottom of the lake. And we tried to put oxygen, dissolved oxygen, 6 to 8 milligrams per liter, so that fish could still be there. So these steps can be taken, but the technology that you're talking about in handling, instead of physical dredging of the lake is something very expensive. So many permits that, lake owner, unless absolutely have to do, you have to do. Otherwise, the bio dredging, which gives you some small, preventing the depth of the lake from getting shallower and shallower by these sediments building up. That is where your technology will be fantastic for most lakes, and also some preventive techniques to prevent these nutrients from coming into the lake. And we even had geese control, so the geese just don't go there, poop all over the place, and it washes in the lake. So some things like that. So I think a combined program of prevention and treatment can really rejuvenate the lakes. For bigger lakes, the techniques you say are absolutely important to have that chemical decomposition, biochemical decomposition of the nutrients, the sediments, the bottom of the lake. So excellent thing, which is a whole package. Then I think people will see it is not just constantly pouring money into fixing things, but prevention along with the regular care of the lake. So great work, great presentation of lakes that you have improved upon. And again, it depends on the commitment of people living around the lake to do it. And with that, anything is possible. Technology is there. That's my Thank you.
Great. It looked like, Judd, did you have a question? You were leaning forward. Thank you, Raj. Very good insights. And congrats on your lakes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Dave. That's a great presentation. I learned a lot. I mean, about treating it with just the herbicides and, how it might look like you're doing something in the short term, but in the long term, it doesn't work. We do have the aerator that we're running 24/7 to try to help, but our problem is timing. As far as the Long Lake here is a unique situation where they can open a sluice gate and drop the water 6 inches, and then if we don't get rain, it'll go a little lower. But it seems like when they do it in the spring, in April, right when the leaves are budding, that seems to be when the weeds are growing at the bottom with the low stagnant water. And I was just wondering if that was a factor. If I'm right, if a foot more of water with this flow through lake, if that would help prevent some of the weeds and algae.
On its own, it may help. I mean, the problem with that is your weeds will only grow in water where the light is reaching to the sediment. they can only germinate. So if you lower the level, then obviously sediment that would not have been able to make leaves grow, make weeds grow, had the water been deeper, will be able to. But by the same token, there'll be some sludge and sediment which was previously underwater, which isn't. So, but certainly from our point of view, the deeper and the more water, the better. Yeah, because if the water's covered, covering the sediment, we can get at it, digest it, and get rid of it.
Thanks. Yeah, it just seems to be the timing of it. It always seems to be when the leaves are budding on the trees, and that just seems to be when they lower the lake, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I think, Dave, you answered a number of the questions that I had heard from people on the impact on stormwater, the additional capacity that's made possible, but also the ability to address the water quality impacts of stormwater. And one thing that wasn't clear, and some folks have brought this up, is like there is a role of mechanical dredging when there might be sludge or non-organic pieces.
Yeah.
Sometimes, can you talk to that? And
so we can only digest the organic sediment, which is where the nutrients are and so on. Your inorganic sediment is sand and soil and things like that. You can't digest that. Typically, where you will find that is, where there's creeks or rivers running into the lake. When you get stormwater, the turbulence will mobilize some of that soil and sand and so on. When the creek hits the water, it slows down, and what settles out first in the shallow areas will be the sand and things like that. So dredging in those sort of areas where the creek comes in and so on, physically dredging that out is often the only way to do it. The finer organic material that's more suspended will tend to settle out more slowly and further out into the lake. So that's often at the deepest part of the lakes, which are typically the most difficult to dredge physically. So the two are not necessarily diametrically opposed to each other. There are situations where you need to do a bit of physical dredging, where it can be reached, where it's shallow enough, where it's sort of cost effective enough, but you're unlikely to be able to dredge into the deeper parts and throughout a big 100, 200, 300 acre lake. I'm hearing a lot of background noise from somewhere. I don't know if everyone else can hear
like
it.
someone has wind, or Raj.
I think Raj has to mute if he could.
Okay, that's better.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
He's outside on a
Yeah.
walk, yes.
Okay. So that's the that's the thing with the biodredging. The biodredging is more holistic. It operates across the whole lake at the same time, but we can't digest and biodredge sand or soil.
Yeah, well, excellent point. And Dave, you brought this up yesterday, the idea of, what you need in a toolkit, since you ran Gowalt Hamilton. Maybe, did you have questions or thoughts on this approach now that you've heard a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I would say thanks very much for the presentation. It was very easy to understand. So my question relates to, it seems the two tools that you're using is the deep aeration, and then also your digestive enzymes. And so is there one that's weighed more heavily than the other, more important, or are they both equally important to the solution?
Yeah, they're all equally important. There's actually three sort of components to it. So, first is to oxygenate, and oxygenate the whole lake, so the shallow and the deep parts as well. The second is the digestive enzymes, so that you can work off that sediment and digest it and mobilize it and so on. The third, we put in micronutrients in order to stimulate the foundation levels of the food web, so that the algae, if there's cyanobacteria, they are kind of outcompeted and beaten out by good algae, if you want to call it that. And then that algae is consumed by the zooplankton. So we've got I'm not aware of anybody else who has thought of this or does this, But by providing those sort of micronutrients, we actually stimulate that the foundation levels of the food web, so that you have that clearance mechanism going through the water. And as I say, that that shows up when people start talking about there's more fish, there's bigger fish, there's more birds of prey, there's the otters are back, the pelicans are back, things like that. We get lots of those sort of stories. Well, that's all evidence that you've re-established the food web and got the biodiversity and the full health and life and so on of the lake back.
Are these solutions, I know you've got your examples that you're showing the improvements, but are they, so if you can save money by reducing the treatment and killing the plants that are there right now, is there an economy that then you regain by adding the aeration and the enzyme treatment and the bionutrition?
Yeah, so the oxygenation system is kind of permanent. We've got Toavaka, for instance, installed in December 2012, and it's still running full steam and doing so. That's a kind of permanent fixture, and if it's properly maintained, you'll get decades out of that. Typically, when we're called in, and the sooner you come in, the better, because typically we find when we're called in, the lake is in a bit of a crisis situation, so we have to dose at pretty high levels to get it under control. So typically year 1, year 2, we'll dose quite high, and then over time, once you have it stabilized, you're able to lower those dosing levels. So you do get those sort of cost benefits kicking in. Typically by sort of year 4 or 5, we're down to less than half, often a quarter of the level of dosing that we started out with. Mm-hmm. So you do get economies of scale over time. Yeah.
Are there any cost parameters that are easily understood? Like, this would be an investment of so many dollars per acre of waterway or something like that?
That's difficult to do from the point of view that depth plays such a part. If you've got a deeper lake, you need less of the radar units. So you get savings from that side. If it's a shallower lake, you need more of them. So it's very difficult to people always keep it as a ballpark figure. Very difficult. Typically, a couple of $1,000, I guess, per acre. In year 1, it really depends on the cost of the hardware. Obviously, is amortized over time. It depends how long you want to amortize that over, and the dosing is highest in the first year or 2, and then drops over time as well. Mm-hmm. So if you cost it out over a 5-year or 10-year period, then it comes right down.
So the closest...
But typically there's an initial cost of getting established, and then after that everything comes down.
Right. So closest one to this area in Illinois, Midwest, is in Grand Rapids. You have a project?
Yeah, that's a smallish one. The other one, we've got another one just a little bit south of St. Louis. That's a 320-acre lake. Uh-huh. That's probably the next closest. The one near Grand Rapids is only 15 acres, so it's smaller.
And Mike Schwartz, who runs the Indian Lake in Missouri, actually participated in a due diligence call with the Lake Lovers team before submitting that proposal. So I'll provide a link to that here. It was very interesting. He answered everyone's questions and was totally surprised because within 3 months they had eradicated I think half a foot of their muck, and were well on their way to what they had hoped to accomplish. And they actually fundraised for that themselves. It was, I believe, 1.5 million over 5 years, and
5 years, yeah.
Delightful team. So I'm putting that in the link. You can look at the recap of that. And Dave, thank you for your questions, and we're happy to have you engage everyone in the community, the lake lover community, with any other additional questions, and also want to tap your expertise and your own experiences. As Raj shared, his maintenance cost for ponds is like $2,000 per acre per year for things similar to what Dave said, once they get into maintenance. But and you're also big on ROI and why Lake County would want to do this. And since you've been sitting there, any final comments before we close?
Yeah, I just say, along to Dave Gaywitz, I thought the presentation was excellent. It was really clear. I just keep thinking you need some simple chart. You have to be careful what you say and document it. But Dave Gaywitz gave me an estimate when we testified in front of Lake County Board. And I was saying, as a business person and taxpayer here, my understanding, the cost of dredging is 8 to 10 times what the
Oh, yeah.
cost